We'll now take a look at how we can handle arrays of objects. So we already know how we can manage arrays of primitive data types such as ints, doubles, characters. Those are pretty straightforward. But how do we handle an array of objects? And what we're going to find is it's a little different than dealing with primitive data types. Let's suppose that we want to create an array of string objects. The way we would declare such an array, it's really no different than a normal array. So we would have string as our type, and then the square braces, and we'll use something like names as the name of our array. And then we would have equals, new string, and then 5. So this will create an array of 5 elements. Now each element here is going to be a reference to a string object. So what this means is all we've done is just create an array of reference variables. That's it. We haven't created the objects yet. So we're going to have to actually create those objects as the next step. So let's say I have the statement names 0 equals Jason Lee Scott. So this line will create a string object and store the value Jason Lee Scott in that object. And the address of this object would be stored in name 0. So then we can do this for additional lines. So we can have the following statements. We can have names 1 be Kimberly Hart. We can have names 2 be Zach Taylor. Names 3 would be Trini Kwan. And names 4 would be Billy Cranston. So we can take all these string objects. So each of these lines would create a string object. It would store the actual string into that object. The address of that object would be stored in each element of the array. So here's the layout of our names array. So we have our variable name names, and this points to an array of reference variables. So we're not storing any actual strings in the array itself, but notice that each element is pointing to a string object. So that's the whole point here, where our array is just containing the memory addresses of all of our string objects. So like for example, name 0, this part right here stores a memory address that points to this particular string object. Now, if we want to output the names in our array, we can just use a for loop. So we get something like this. So we'd have our loop control variable. So we have I equals 0 as long as I is less than the length of the names. We increment I, and then we just do a print or a print line statement where we just print out the individual elements of the array. And remember that each element of the array can be treated as its own variable. So since we have an array of string objects, we have a set of individual strings, so we can use string methods on each element of the array. So let's take a look at a couple of examples. So we have names.0 equals Jason Lee Scott. So this will take a look at the string in name 0 and see if it equals to the string Jason Lee Scott. In this case, since those are the same, they will return true. We can also do substrings. So we can take a look at names 4, for example, and do names4.substring, and then we can go from 0 to 6. So this will give me a reference to an object with the string Billy, because we're getting the first 5 characters of the string. Now, what about other types of objects? I mean, strings are great, but there are objects of other types of classes as well. So for example, let's say we want to keep track of 100 employees. Maybe we need to know when they've clocked in and when they clocked out. So how do we keep track of all that? Well, if you remember, we created this lovely clock class earlier, so we can take advantage of that. In fact, what we can do is create 2 different arrays, each of them being 100 elements, and each element would be a reference variable of type clock. So one array will store all the arrival times, or all the times where the employees clock in, and then another array would store all the departure times, or when all the employees clock out. So here's the code that would create those 2 arrays. So just as we can create arrays of strings, integers, floats, doubles, characters, we can do arrays of objects of classes that we've created as well. So we can do clock, square braces, start time equals new clock 100, clock end time equals new clock 100, adding in the square braces. So we're allowed to do this. So the way we would handle it is that each index would correspond to a specific employee. So like for example, I can have a start time 10 and an end time 10. Those would give me the arrival and departure times for employee number 10. Now, since it is an array of objects, we still need to instantiate each element in both arrays. So I have to go through each element in both of them and then make sure I create a new object of that class. Because remember, when we're dealing with arrays of objects, we technically have an array of reference variables. So for example, if I want to instantiate start time, we can use a for loop that just goes through each element of start time, and we just set it to new clock, which would create an object of the clock class. Once we've done this, we can now use all the methods from the clock class that we've created in order to manipulate the time. So for example, if we want to set the arrival time for some employee, I can do something like start time, and we'll just use employee 49, for example. So we'll do start time 49 dot set time, and then 8, 5, and 10. So that just gives us the time that that employee came in. And we can also output the time by printing that particular element of the array. So remember, we can use any method of the clock class for any element of the array. Now, if we're going to print the element of the array, we'll just assume that we have defined the toString method.